Hello, and welcome to another episode of Themes and Variations, the Aldous Huxley podcast, a production of the Aldous Huxley Centre in Zurich. I'm your host, Emily Reed, and today we're going to be diving into Aldous Huxley's early years as a writer, an era packed with social climbing, artistic elitism, bold experimentation, and maybe a few fallings out. We'll be particularly focused on his time spent at Garsington Manor and exploring his friendship with the modernist writer Katherine Mansfield. And to guide us through it, we are joined today by the brilliant Dr. Gerri Kimber. Dr. Kimber is a visiting professor of English at the University of Northampton and a world-leading Katherine Mansfield scholar. She's the author and co-editor of more than 40 books and has served as the president of the Katherine Mansfield Society for a decade. Now she's turning her expertise into a major new biography of Katherine Mansfield entitled Katherine Mansfield, A Hidden Life, which has just been released through Reaction Books. Based on compelling new research, Gerri challenges previous conceptions surrounding the author's life, uncovers friendships and relationships that have formerly been barely acknowledged, and offers innovative readings of Mansfield's most celebrated stories. Her international reputation has taken her onto radio and television in both New Zealand and the UK, and she's been invited to speak around the world, from Japan to Switzerland to France and to New Zealand. We are very lucky to have her here on the podcast today. So, hi, Gerri, it's lovely to have you.
Hi, Emily. No, I feel very privileged to be on this wonderful podcast. So thank you for inviting me.
No problem at all, thank you. So I was just thinking to get us started off with this discussion, mostly for the benefit of anyone listening to this podcast who hasn't read Katherine Mansfield, I was wondering if you would be able to maybe tell us a little bit more about her life, and about the kind of text that she's written.
For sure, yeah. So what you mentioned just a minute ago about Huxley was bold and brilliant. Well, I think what people might not understand is quite how bold Mansfield herself was, and what a daring very short life she led. And there's a very famous quote, which I think really does exemplify Mansfield at the time that she and Huxley were forging their own independent friendship. And this was in 1917, when she was estranged from her then partner, John Middleton Murray. And she'd gone to see Leonard and Virginia Woolf. And Virginia had written in her diary, this is on the 11th of October, 1917. The dinner last night went off. The delicate things were discussed. We could both wish that one's first impression of KM was not that she stinks like a, well, civet cat that had taken to street walking. In truth, I'm a little shocked by her commonness at first sight, lying so hard and cheap. However, when this diminishes, she is so intelligent and inscrutable that she repays friendship. So this was the woman that Huxley met at Garsington. And Mansfield, who was the daughter of the chairman of the Bank of New Zealand, who had grown up with immense privilege. Her family were related to the Prime Minister of New Zealand via her mother's brother, who married the daughter of the New Zealand Prime Minister. They were in the top echelons of New Zealand society. She had been educated at Queen's College in London, sent home in inverted commas, because home was still England if you were the colonial New Zealander at the time, to be educated at this very expensive school. And the last thing Mansfield was common.
Mm-hmm.
But she was very fond of an expensive French perfume called Genêt Fleuri, flowering broom. But clearly perfume was not something you did in the Bloomsbury group, and so they vilified her for it. But Mansfield wore brightly coloured clothes. She was wearing scarlet stockings, cut her hair in a bob, when most other women, including Virginia Woolf, who never did that. Virginia Woolf's skirts were still very long. She was ultra modern. And I think for the young Huxley, bearing in mind that there's a 6-year age difference, he was very much a young undergraduate at the time. And I think he got his degree in 1917, I think. And he got a first, didn't he, in English, which was a very unusual subject to study at the time. in Oxford. So he was sort of quite pioneering in that sense. But Mansfield was very risque and very modern. And I think for somebody like Huxley, who even then was forging his own path, he was with very tentative steps at that time. But I think that's what would have appealed to him. So she was born in 1888. She died in 1923. So she was just 34 years old when she died of tuberculosis. Very sadly, she only wrote short stories. She did attempt 3 novels, but nothing came of them. I think towards the end of her life, she was so ill, and short stories paid such good money, and she needed money for treatments, that I think when she realized she was dying, the idea of writing a novel just left her. But she often used to write, when I write a novel, I'm going to write a novel, but it never happened. But she was very feisty. She had a wicked sense of humor. Leonard Woolf wrote in his autobiography that in those days, in those Garsington days, no one made him laugh as much as she did. But she had a tumultuous life between 1909 and 1911. One stillbirth, 3 abortions going into 1912. And then when she met John Middleton Murray, her life did calm down. But she was leading the free life of a woman of the 1960s. But sadly, what she didn't have was the pill and antibiotics. So that laid her open to all sorts of infections, including gonorrhea and tuberculosis, which, as we know, killed her in January 1923. So that's the woman we're dealing with. She was feisty, charismatic. She wasn't pretty in the conventional sense, but she had a very striking face, eyes wide apart. She wore her hair in this sort of bobbish style with a straight cut fringe, and everyone thought she had the look of a Japanese doll, which did make her very striking, and clearly a wonderful sense of humour, which appealed to members of the Garsington set. She was never in Bloomsbury. She wasn't rich enough or didn't have the background to be one of the Bloomsbury group, but she did form part of that Garsington set, if you like, for a while. And of course, that's where she met Huxley.
So we're going to look at another one of Huxley's predictions for the future, except that this time we're kind of appropriating the predictions segment to look at how themes that will emerge as almost dominant strands of Huxley's thinking later are traceable in his very earliest novels, in this case, Antic Hay, the second novel Huxley published, which, as well as being a comic social satire of pretentious artists and so-called innovators, also contains some devastating commentary on British society after the end of World War One.
So one of the main narrative threads in Antic Hay sees the protagonist, Theodore Gumbrell, meet a young woman called Emily, with whom he becomes emotionally involved, despite his cynicism. She seems to represent this innocence that eludes most of his social set and invites him to a cottage in the countryside.
Oh, that's nice.
That's lovely. Yeah,
Okay,
a nice
yeah.
romantic little getaway. But he doesn't make it.
Uh-uh.
On the way, he's apprehended by Mrs. Viviash, who is a strikingly beautiful heartbreaker who, like many, many women, has been left without the great love of her life owing to the very recent World War. And she tries to fill her heartbreak with men, basically, these shallow, emotionless sexual connections with men who fundamentally she doesn't really care that much about, in order to try to fill this void. So in this part of Antic Hay, Mrs. Viviash lures Gumbrell off his track into a lunch that seems to spiral into an indeterminately long time where they go to plays and dances and drinks. And early in
And this
this,
is what he does instead of going to his cottage holiday with Emily, right?
it is,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
So early in this episode of the book, Mrs. Viviash soon turns to despair amid the pleasures that they are indulging in. So I will read an extract from the book now. So in this extract, Mrs. Viviash and Gumbrell have had an exquisitely fine meal and they're just walking home. And suddenly Mrs. Viviash says the following: Will one ever recapture the old thrills? She asked, rather fatiguedly, as they drove slowly through the traffic of Regent Street. Not by chasing after them, said Gumbrel, in whom the clown had quite evaporated. If one sat still enough, they might perhaps come back of their own accord. There would be the faint sound as if it were of feet approaching through the quiet. It isn't only food, said Mrs. Viviash, who had closed her eyes and was leaning back in her corner. So I can well believe. It's everything. Nothing's the same now. I feel it never will be. So here it becomes clear that she is haunted by the death of her former lover, and this upset only becomes greater as they try to indulge in further pleasures to try to distract from the deep hurt within. So this excerpt from the dance she takes Gumbrel to is worth reading at length because it captures this increasing sense of nihilism. So just as a little disclaimer, this excerpt contains some racial terms that we wouldn't consider appropriate for use today, but I will still read the extract in full, just to make you aware. Lachrymosely, the hilarious blackamoors chanted their question, mournfully pregnant with its foreknown reply. Nil, omnipresent nil, world soul, spiritual informer of all matter, nil in the shape of a black-breeched moon-based toreador, nil the man with the greyhound nose, nil as four blackamoors, nil in the form of a divine tune, nil the faces one ought to know by sight, reflected in the mirrors of the hall. Nil this Gumbrel whose arm is round one's waist, whose feet step in and out among one's own. Nothing at all. That's why there'll be no wedding at St. George's, Hanover Square. Oh, desperate experiment with Nil Viviash, that charming boy, that charming nothing at all, engaged at the moment in hunting elephants, hunting fever and carnivores among the tiki pygmies. That's why there'll be no wedding on Wednesday week. For Lycidas is dead ere his prime. For the light strawy hair, not a lock left, the brown face, the red-brown hands, and the smooth boy's body, milk white, milk warm, are nothing at all, nothing now at all, nil these 5 years, and the shining blue eyes as much nil as the rest. Always the same people, complained Mrs. Viviash, looking around the room. The old familiar faces, never anyone new. Where's the younger generation, Gumbrel? We're old, Theodore. There are millions younger than we are. Where are they?
So I think what's really interesting here is the reflections that Mrs. Viviash are feeling are almost interlaced with the experience she's having. And I think it could be described as a form of literary counterpoint. Of course, Huxley really tries to go to town with technique like that in Point Counterpoint itself, and also in Eyeless and Gaza that come later, where he's blending a couple of different things together to kind of see what happens. So he's blending the experience of watching this jazz band play with Mrs. Viviash's dark reflections, but in particular the sense of perceiving a kind of nothingness to the culture in front of you, to the world around you, this kind of emptiness. It's quite interesting, really, isn't it? Because this is depicted very negatively, but then much later in his life, Huxley will come to understand the importance of this kind of vacuum or void, in terms of his theology and spiritualism and philosophy. I do think it's a really interesting example of combining of different threads at the same time.
So we can see some of Huxley's later ideas and also literary techniques prefigured in his earliest novels. And I think it's interesting because most people do associate Huxley with his later works, particularly Brave New World, but also more popular works such as Perennial Philosophy, Doors of Perception. And there seems to be relatively little enthusiasm for his earlier novels in the popular conscience. So hopefully this segment, and indeed this episode, has convinced you, if you weren't already, that Huxley's early works and his early novels are definitely worth exploring, because you do find some of his later ideas germinating within those earlier works, and it's a fascinating literary trajectory.
And they're also lots of fun to read as well.
Oh yeah,
truly hilarious, with lots of very silly characters and conversations, so definitely worth reading for that reason too.
Absolutely. Yeah, and And you paint such a colourful picture of Mansfield, and
She
there are so
was
many.
colourful.
There are so many different threads that we could pull upon. Her modernity in terms of both her fashion and her style of writing, and also her background. You sort of allude to it must have been a very interesting and perhaps strange dynamic to be a New Zealander in 19 teens, 1920s.
Yeah, she was. I mean, and I think they looked down at her. She used to refer to the Bloomsbury Group disparagingly as the Blooms, separate word, berries, as in a fruit. And she used to say, that they were looking down on her and that she was just an outcast, really, allowed to look but not to enter. I mean, she could see exactly who they were and what they were. And of course, Huxley was never part of the Bloomsbury Group. I mean, he had a distinguished family and a distinguished background, but his life went in a very different direction, didn't it? He was never one of those sort of intellectuals who sort of hung out with Lytton Strachey, being bitchy about people and not doing much else and writing the odd book. I mean, Huxley wanted to do something very different, didn't he?
Yes, yeah, definitely. You've also written extensively on the relationship between Huxley and Katherine Mansfield. And again, you evoke such a colourful time in Huxley's early career, particularly his early years as a visitor of Garsington Manor. And for our listeners, what kind of environment do you feel this would have been for Huxley and Mansfield? And how might this have affected their relationship in those early years?
Well, I think initially they would both have been attracted to each other, not sexually. I mean, as I say, Huxley was so much younger.
Mm.
But I think it was the fact that so many friendships, in any case, were initiated at Garsington. I mean, Ottilie Morrell was supremely good at doing that, at inviting, and so generous. I mean, I think people forget when they're so busy um, sort of mocking her for her speech, her mannerisms, her dress. Everything was so exotic with Ottilie Morrell, but she was so generous with her money, with her house. I mean, Huxley stayed there for months, didn't he, working the land as a conscientious objector, and anyone could go, anyone could stay, and yet so often, and Huxley was guilty of it as well. She was mocked and lampooned in all sorts of various literary outputs for being who she was. But their initial acquaintance at Garsington, especially in that year 1917, when Mansfield was estranged from Murray, their relationship had gone through a very difficult time. And Mansfield, as I relate in my new biography, had gone back to a former love, A.R. Araj, who was the editor of the very famous weekly paper, The New Age. But she was seeing Huxley at this time, not in a relationship sense, but more like as a sort of like a brother. They would go for rides on the top of London omnibuses, and he would come for tea, and they would chat. And I can imagine, because Mansfield was such a charismatic personality, you could imagine young Huxley being, quite taken with her and admiring her sense of humour. And the relationship, because Murray was separate to that and not involved, had very little to do with each other during 1917, that she was able to cultivate that relationship with Huxley. Things only really fell apart when she and Murray got married in 1918. Mansfield, in early 1918, had her first hemorrhage of the lungs, started to become quite ill, realised that she couldn't be gadding about and that she'd better, to coin a phrase, shack up with somebody rather than nobody. And Murray offered her security at a time when she never needed it more. But he was, as I recount in my biography, the worst possible man that she could have married. They were so different in so many ways, and Murray was incapable of supporting anyone emotionally, never mind physically. He was just the wrong man for her in every sense. But by then it was too late. When you're as ill as Mansfield became, and she became ill quite quickly, from being like quite well in 1917 when Huxley first met her, to her first hemorrhage of the lungs, being stuck in Paris during the bombardment in early 1918, when she was trying to get back to England. And when she arrived, she was an emaciated wreck, basically. And from that time on, she was an invalid. And so by allying herself with Murray, they got married. And then in 1919, when Murray became editor of the Athenaeum and employed Huxley, as you know, as one of his sub-editors, and Huxley saw through Murray and saw him for what he was, the relationship was never the same again. But that wasn't Mansfield's fault in so much as Huxley fell out with Murray, and because Mansfield was Murray's wife, he fell out with Mansfield as well, because they were a team on the Athenaeum.
Yeah.
Mansfield was really the invisible editor of the Athenaeum for those months for many of the months when Murray was editor. I mean, she would tell him what was good, what wasn't good, what to include, what not to include. And she really, really had some very unflattering things to say about Huxley, about his role at the paper. But I think she was just doing that to support Murray. Plus, she was isolated on her own in France. And I think she wanted bolstering as much as she felt Murray needed bolstering. But it was that destroyed their own personal relationship, which had grown. I think they had grown to be quite fond of each other. So it was quite sad. I do sometimes think that if Mansfield had never had Murray, and she hadn't have got, I mean, it's all these if she hadn't have become so ill, and if Murray hadn't been in her life, I'm not saying they would have got together, but I do think that relationship might have flourished instead of really dying a death, because for many years afterwards, Huxley wasn't very kind either about her or her work, as you know.
Indeed, yeah. And so what we're talking about is it could have flourished into a productive, creative relationship.
I
And
do think that, yeah.
yeah, and I think it's interesting as well. We've sort of mentioned this a couple of times, the impact of Mansfield's illness on both her writing output and also the subsequent trajectory of her life, especially in relation to John Middleton Murray, and the fact that her illness meant not only did she never get around to writing the novel that she wanted to write, but also that she felt that she had to kind of cling to Murray, perhaps. Would that be a fair assessment?
Oh, absolutely. That's exactly what happened. And the sad thing is that Murray was incapable of being anyone's rock. You know, so what she was clinging to was, in essence, a man who failed her on almost every level. You know, he mostly thought about himself. And much as Huxley was very quite naughty really in his depiction of Murray as Dennis Burlap in Point Counterpoint, but actually many people said afterwards that that wasn't far from the truth, and especially that Mansfield cult that Murray cultivated after Mansfield's death became one of the tools that Huxley used for attacking what he saw as Murray's canonization of Mansfield after her death. Because in the novel, Burlap has a dead wife called Susan, as you know, who he also elevates to quasi-sainthood. And he uses her letters and her spiritual agonies to bolster his own authority. He sentimentalizes her suffering and appropriates her holiness, which he invented, to boost his own cultural image. And that's exactly how Huxley saw Murray, and how he felt that Murray used Mansfield's legacy after her death. So even though he might well have admired Mansfield and admired her stories, which later in life he did admit to, after her death, he was disparaging in a review of the stories, because he hated Murray so much by then, and because Mansfield for many years, and it wasn't just Huxley doing it, was tarnished by the fact that Murray by the early 1930s was the most hated man in English letters. So it wasn't really, when Murray died in 1957, Mansfield was reborn. And that's no exaggeration really, because the editing of all her work was it was done so cleverly. I mean, Murray wasn't chief censor during the war for nothing. I mean, he was, rightly recognized after the war. He was awarded an OBE for his services. And being chief censor, you had to have a good editor's eye as well as everything else. But that chief censorship, never was it better used than in the way he edited Mansfield's work and her life to create a persona.
That is such an interesting link to make as well. And I do wonder as well whether the relationship between Mansfield and Murray is almost like a strange mirror between Huxley and Maria, because of course he also suffered from poor health with his failing eyesight. And unlike Murray, the accounts of Maria are of a very supportive partner through Huxley's blindness or poor sightedness. By all accounts, she used to drive him around in the Citroen and on these dangerous windy Italian roads. And it does seem like she was a very supportive partner to Huxley through his own illness, and that kind of throws into contrast how Murray failed Mansfield as a partner to her in her ill health as well.
Absolutely. And you only have to look at Leonard and Virginia Woolf as well. I mean, Virginia suffered so much mostly mental ill health, and Leonard was constantly there for her. He never let her down. And Maria was exactly the same with Huxley, wasn't she? She was his support. She just kept their lives going in the same way that Leonard did for Virginia. And it was the opposite of what Murray did. Murray was only ever had one person in mind, and one person who came first for him, and that was Murray himself, until Mansfield died, and then it was all about Mansfield.
Yeah, and I do want to pick up on this point that Huxley casts Murray as burlap in Point Counterpoint, and how he's using people that he already knows, Mansfield and Murray, in his works. And I wanted to pick up on this point because Huxley and Mansfield do indeed take inspiration from each other in their writings. So
Yeah,
for Mansfield, the character of Eddie in her short story Bliss is
yeah,
clearly based on Huxley. And I'll read a quick quote for anybody who is not familiar with Bliss. So she writes, "The bell rang. It was lean, pale Eddie Warren, as usual, in a state of acute distress. 'It is the right house, isn't it?' he pleaded. 'Oh, I think so. I hope so,' said Bertha brightly. 'I have had such a dreadful experience with the taximan. He was most sinister. I couldn't get him to stop. The more I knocked and called, the faster he went. And in the moonlight, this bizarre figure with the flattened head crouching over the little wheel.' He shuddered, taking off an immense white silk scarf. Bertha noticed that his socks were white too. Most charming. 'But how dreadful!' she cried. 'Yes, it really was,' said Eddie, following her into the drawing room. 'I saw myself driving through eternity in a timeless taxi.' So I don't know if I got it quite right, but I tried to emulate the way that she writes Huxley's his rhythm when he's speaking.
yeah.
Very what was how does she
And
describe
it's
it?
his strange accent on certain syllables, like the
Yes.
opposite syllables that you would expect to be accented
Mm,
are what he and the way that she describes it. But Virginia Woolf, in any number of letters and diary entries, she also mocked the way Huxley spoke in those days. I mean, we've all listened to Huxley because we're very fortunate. Sadly, there are no recordings of Mansfield. I mean, she died too young, but
mm,
we do have recordings of Aldous Huxley, and he definitely in older age had lost that unique way of speaking, which he clearly had as a young man. Um,
absolutely. Did
yeah,
she describes it as affected and dandyish. I'm not sure if that's
yes,
quite the right quote, but certainly
yeah,
dandyish, which is quite charming. But like for his part as well, obviously in Point Counterpoint after Mansfield's death, but also in his early novels such as Chrome Yellow and Those Barren Leaves, Mansfield also appears as Anne in Chrome Yellow, and Mary Thriplow, the highly self-conscious woman who observes as keenly as she self constructs to suit the perceived preferences of those around her, like Mr. Calamy. So he creates these Mansfield inspired characters
Yes,
in
although I
his early
think in
novels.
Chrome Yellow, the character is actually, it's not that harsh. And by the time you get to Susan, who obviously is already dead, he paints a picture of a woman who is actually, you actually feel sorry for her, because as the novel progresses, you understand quite what she had to put up with in being married to Dennis Burlap, you know,
Mm.
and all those painfully personal articles that Huxley invents, doesn't he, for Burlap, that Burlap apparently written, of such is the kingdom of heaven, and exploiting all the grief that he apparently felt.
Mm.
Um, and Huxley clearly, I think, was a man who didn't approve of emotional exhibitionism, certainly in the field of literary study. I think he did write, didn't he write a book called Vulgarity in Literature? And
Mm.
he said that in literature, it's vulgar to make a display of emotions which you do not naturally have, but think you ought to have because all the best people have them. It's also, he said, vulgar to have emotions and to express them so badly that you seem to have no natural feelings, but to be merely fabricating emotions by a process of literary forgery. He could have written that about Murray.
Absolutely. So I wonder to what extent these portraits of each other in Huxley and Mansfield's works, to what extent might we be able to take these at face value, or to what extent might they be
Yes,
exaggerated?
I think that's such a fascinating question. You know, I still maintain that I don't think I think that Huxley was lampooning and ridiculing Murray, not so much Mansfield. And I think, but because of his dislike of Murray for many, many years, I mean, and it only increased after Lawrence's death, it just brought all their hatred for each other to a high point. And it's quite fascinating to read about, but it must have been ghastly at the time. And I think that, and Mansfield was just caught in the crossfire. When Huxley said that he thought that her writing was slight, etc., etc., in 1925, and it's an essay in the Traveller's Way or something. I can't remember the title, but
Oh,
anyway,
Along the Road, I think.
Along the Road.
Yeah,
Sorry, the
that's
Traveller's Way.
okay.
Just make up titles. But yeah, I think he was. It was actually he was reacting to his dislike of Murray rather than his dislike of Mansfield, because by then Murray, he had started the Adelphi, the literary paper that he edited for a number of years, and for the first 2 years there wasn't a single issue that wasn't dedicated to Mansfield's posthumous writing. There were poems dedicated to her, poems by her, poems about her. Some of her short stories that weren't published during her lifetime were there. Everything. It was just a Mansfield machine. Everyone was sick of it. Huxley would have looked on aghast at all of this, as would all of his friends and colleagues as well. And so then, when he was asked to write about Katherine Mansfield and her stories, what would you say? Would you then say, no, I really, really admired her. She had, a gift for short storytelling that was never equaled. Or would you, knowing that she was the ex-wife of a man that you despised, put her down to sort of act almost as a counterbalance to that, if that makes sense?
It does. It's a really interesting question and a really interesting trajectory given their previous friendship and previous closeness, and that they're writing about each other in their works and providing us with these insights into what they are like as people. But then there seems to be, driven by this animosity between Huxley and Murray, a rift between Huxley and Mansfield that
Yeah.
does result in them going to quite, as you say, very critical places of each other's work. So it flows both ways. And um,
Yes.
there are a couple of examples that I took from your, well, I say your recent chapter. I think it was published in Mansfield and the Bloomsbury Group
That was
in
in 2017. Yeah.
2017. Yeah, yeah. So There's a couple of examples that you pull out of both of them criticizing each other's work by the 1920s, which are absolutely fascinating. So you write that in February 1920, Mansfield sent Murray a review of Limbo, a collection of stories and a play by Huxley. The
Yes.
review itself, unfortunately, now lost. And Murray had commented on Mansfield's review's rather scathing tone, and she had responded, "I'm so sorry about Aldous. Do publish another review by another hand if you've a mind to. I'll absolutely understand. Only I could not say more. They were such bilge in
Yes.
capitals." And her reaction to Chrome Yellow in 1922 is not
Yeah.
any more positive. She writes, "I haven't seen Aldous's book, sorry, and I do not want to. The idea bores me so terribly, and I won't waste time on it. The only reviewer who really realised its dullness was Rebecca West. She said just what was right. She shuddered at the silliness of it. But everybody else seems to puff him up. It gets very awkward if young men are forced to feed out of their friends' inkpots in this way. In fact, I confess
Yeah.
it downright disgusts me." Which
Which was so disingenuous because she was doing that all the time. She was
exactly, yeah,
mining friends, mining family, in order to, she when she was creating characters for her stories, more often than not, those people actually lived, and she was depicting real characters. So, I mean, that
absolutely.
was a bit naughty of her, to be honest.
Exactly. I was hoping to ask you, and you, in fact, answered my question in as many words. If they're actually not both being a little bit hypocritical as writers
So
who are
much.
continually mining their own friendship networks and their
Yeah.
own relationships for material
Yes.
for their stories. I mean, I think considering the context of keep going back to point counterpoint, but reading the first few pages of Point Counterpoint, where we have a woman who's decided to leave her husband and now she's pregnant and now he's sick of her and he's going off to find new fun with somebody else. Imagining being Maria typing up that manuscript just after Huxley's infatuation with Nancy Cunard. Um,
Yes.
I mean, that sounds absolutely brutal as a as an exercise. Yeah.
You
So
have to feel sorry for Maria sometimes, don't you? Much as we
oh,
admire
absolutely.
Huxley, for the genius that he was in so many ways, I think the women in his life did
Yeah,
not have an easy time of it, and especially Maria, I would say, in those early days.
absolutely. I almost feel like it requires a whole episode of the women in Huxley's life. Maybe we
Yeah.
should plan for
Oh,
one of those.
that would be fascinating. Yeah, I'm currently
Absolutely.
writing a lecture on Nancy Cunard, and oh my goodness, I'm just bowled over by her. But that is a completely aside from everything that we're discussing today. But what a
A little
woman!
bit.
What a
Oh yeah.
woman!
What do you want to sum up for our viewers? Maybe give like a little teaser for what we could cover in a future episode.
Oh well, I mean, we could cover so much, couldn't we? I think the women in Huxley's life, because that could encompass so much, couldn't it? And people that were very much crossing over in the Garsington circles, the to a certain extent the Bloomsbury group,
Mm.
but and all the women that sort of hung around them in between, because Mansfield knew them all before she died, and there were a lot of women in Huxley's life. I think Huxley was a huge admirer of women. I think he wasn't, a misogynist in that sense. He did. I think he liked women, probably liked them too much, and the
Yes.
open relationships always astonished me that Maria put up with so much. But then, of course, she was leading her own rather strange life, wasn't she,
Well,
as
I think she
well, which
also rather
suited them
liked
both.
women.
Yes,
They had that in common.
they did have that in common. Oh, wouldn't you like? I often think that just to be a little fly on the wall in some of
Mm.
these drawing rooms at the time and to listen to that conversation. Chrome Yellow is one of my top, definitely it's in my top 10. I'd hesitate to put it in my top 5 books of all time, but I
Mm.
absolutely love Chrome Yellow. For me, it depicts that era when Mansfield was a success, when Mansfield was becoming well known for her short stories, and that she was part of literary London. She was she was going to Garsington. She would have heard those conversations. She would have known those artists, known those writers. And I think Huxley's, it's a little gem of a novel in the way that it depicts that era, that moment in time that they both knew so well. And I just want to be a character in Chrome Yellow, which is, in spite of all Huxley's remonstrations, was definitely set in Garsington, and Ottilie Murrell definitely was the owner of the house in which it is set.
Absolutely.
Even though
I don't think anyone really believes Huxley when he tries to deny that it's not just a replica of the things that you're seeing at Garsington.
No, absolutely not. But wouldn't you have wanted to be there as well?
Oh yes.
It's I mean, I just love that book so much.
Yeah.
I can read and reread it and never tire of it.
Absolutely. When people ask me what my favorite Huxley novel is, I will usually say it's Chrome Yellow, because I mean, for all sorts of reasons, but very much for the reasons that you describe as well. It is such a portrait of a really exciting, creative, artistic, literary time of curated salons and personalities. And just as we've been describing as well, these creative friendships and fallouts. It's honestly, it is, I completely agree, a wonderful read. Absolutely love it. So welcome to another one of our segments on aphorisms. These are sections where we will take just a short snippet of wisdom that Huxley wrote during his career, and we talk about the context for it and what it might have meant. Because the theme of today's episode is a focus on the earlier novels, we are going to be starting with Chrome Yellow, in fact, Aldous Huxley's first novel. And what we have here is an aphorism that is uttered by one of the characters, Mr. Scogan, as the gentlemen are drinking port in the drawing room of the great house Chrome Yellow. And he is discussing how one's context can give rise to certain characteristics in one's personality. So this is known as the Caesar speech that Mr. Scogan makes. I'll give you a little flavour of it. So Mr. Scogan says, "I might have been something fabulous, but circumstances were against me. I was born and brought up in a county rectory. I passed my youth doing a great deal of utterly senseless hard work for a very little money. The result is that now, in middle age, I am the poor thing that I am. But perhaps it is as well. Perhaps, too, it's as well that Dennis hasn't been permitted to flower into a little Nero, and that Ivor remains only potentially a Caligula. Yet it's better so, no doubt. But it would have been more amusing as a spectacle if they had had the chance to develop, untrammeled, the full horror of their personalities." So this is a flavour of the Caesar speech that Scogan makes. The aphorism in question is as follows.
Oh, it's going to appear here now, right?
Yes.
Yeah. It's going to appear.
The aphorism goes.
Ready for it? Sorry.
So the aphorism in question, which should appear here, is as follows. "One is always alone in suffering. The fact is depressing when one appears to be the sufferer, but it makes pleasure possible for the rest of the world."
So this is a really interesting idea. It's the idea that the limit to suffering is almost what is possible to be experienced by just one person at a time. Mm-hmm. So it's almost like a great consolation to imagine that you're always alone in suffering, in a sense of the only thing that's possible for anyone to experience is the subjective experience of one's own suffering. We can't experience suffering at scale as a collective. We can only have our own experiences. Mm-hmm. I think it's really interesting that Mr. Scogan is putting forward this idea of a solipsistic model of suffering, or a phenomenological model of suffering, in particular because one of the inspirations for Mr. Scogan is the logical positivist philosopher Bertrand Russell. And Bertrand Russell comes from a lineage of English philosophers like Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, and so on, who are utilitarians. And the idea behind utilitarianism, as the name implies, is utility. So the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest amount of people, the minimum amount of suffering for the minimum amount of people. And that's how we should decide what we're going to do.
And it is interesting as well that, and this actually comes up in many of Huxley's early novels, the shadow backdrop of the recent history of the First World War. This is where this speech is coming from, this idea that because there was a war, it created this environment and these demands on people that turned them into these warlike individuals, these Caesars, as it were. And had that war not have happened, then these people might have been allowed to become pastors or farmers or whatever. And so this is actually an important idea for Huxley throughout his career, actually, the idea that there are these latent psychological tendencies that can be both suppressed and amplified as well. And this is an idea that is equally being expressed in his earliest novel.
Yeah, and the Caesar reference is, obviously very apposite to the time because this is around the same time that the black shirts under Mussolini in Italy are basically about to seize power when this book's being written, and they have brought back the Roman salute, which is almost like the Caesar salute. I won't actually do it.
No, please don't.
I won't do it on the fine. So I think it's this idea that we are effectively products of our environment and that latent tendencies can be suppressed or can be developed.
There's a lot to unpack.
There's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, I know, and I do enjoy that this is the tenor of the boys' chat over port in the drawing room.
But no one really enjoys listening to Skogan, though, do they? He's a bit of a foghorn.
Well, that's true,
voice.
actually.
He just kind of mutely say, "Oh, okay, well, thank you. Or can we talk about something else now?" So he's almost like screaming into a void with his theories. Even though in this case of this one, this idea that suffering is only possible for one person to experience at a time, it's actually quite a significant and interesting idea buried in that. So, yeah.
Yeah. I think I only really had one more question to finish us up on, and which is...
Can't believe it's all gone by so quickly. I'm enjoying it so much.
Me too, honestly. I'd like to sit here all afternoon and just chat away, but
real life beckons.
Yeah. I'd love to know from your perspective, why do you think that people who enjoy the works of Aldous Huxley, Huxleyans, Huxleyites, whatever we want to call ourselves, why should they read Katherine Mansfield's works?
This is such an interesting question, and I think I do have an answer. I did think about it, but I think they do have a lot in common in the way that they write, but also they are both acute observers of human nature. Mansfield was, and Huxley definitely was. I mean, Mansfield could get into the core of a person, and just delineate in a few short strokes, because she didn't write a novel. And in a short story, as you know, it's what you leave out is almost more important than what you put in. But she was a genius at doing that. They were both socially and morally aware. Huxley had a great social conscience, one of the most brilliant social consciences of the 20th century. Mansfield died too young to be recognised as such, but she definitely had that. And some of her stories, Life of Ma Parker, Miss Brill, really bring that to the fore. They were both psychologically sophisticated. Mansfield understood people's minds so well and brings that, and that again is brought forward in her story. Just think of Bertha in Bliss. Bertha hasn't got a clue what's going on, but we know what's going on. And they're both, of course, modernist, certainly Huxley's earlier novels. Both they have that stylistically modernist way of writing. And Mansfield's stories, Huxley was very intelligent. Mansfield didn't go to university. She didn't have that sort of intellectual background that Huxley was fortunate enough to be born into, but they did have that same mix, I think, of intelligence and emotional acuity. They both were very good at getting to the crux of what makes characters tick. and also a certain aesthetic refinement. We value that in Huxley. We value his aesthetics, the way that he can delineate a country house or a party or a street, walking down a street, and his eye, which, considering that he was so short-sighted and partially blind, it's almost a miracle that he was able to be so acutely aware of his surroundings. And Huxley, we value that, his brilliance, for all those elements that I've just described in his novels. And in Mansfield, those exact same elements are concentrated into pitch perfect, poignant little narratives. For example, even you just take The Garden Party, one of Mansfield's most famous stories. It's a satire of bourgeois manners, social pretensions, very similar to Huxley's social critiques in Chrome Yellow. But both the short story and Huxley's novel, the authors are exploring psychological complexities, ethical awarenesses, and they both use poetic imagery, attention to fleeting moments. Huxley had a marvelous sensitivity to beauty, and especially in those early novels. Later, of course, as we know, he becomes more cynical, doesn't he? And I think the transient beauty that he depicts in those very early novels and poems and short stories, I think slightly fades. To me, that's a disappointment, because I love that part of early Huxley. And even in Bliss, you know, the story where Huxley is actually a character, again, you've got emotional and moral ambiguity, which Huxley was brilliant at depicting himself, psychological tension, and that compressed intensity of the emotional drama that Mansfield portrays in a short narrative, and which Huxley was equally brilliant at depicting in his longer narratives.
Oh, fantastic. That's such a wonderful answer, Gerri.
Thank you. Well, I did think about it, but the more I thought about it, the more I just want to sort of like just start typing, because there is so much to say. I think they both, and certainly the younger Huxley, I think as he gets older and we're more talking about dystopia, etc., and utopia, but his novels do take on a very different sort of outlook to those early ones. But I think in those early ones, there is so much similarity between Mansfield, the short story writer, and Huxley, the brilliant modernist novelist, that I think there's a lot to say.
And I do think that talking about these different movements of Huxley's career and these different modes that he adopts throughout his long writing career, when you bring that into comparison with Mansfield, it does make you wonder what direction she might have gone in had she lived longer.
The $6 million question, isn't it? We all, as Mansfield scholars, we all like have our own ideas, but I mean, undoubtedly she would have written novels. They were always there, but she just, you know, short story immediately paid her money, and that money went for cures, for quackery type cures, like the irradiation of the spleen, which just made her ill. It cost her thousands, you know, but it was an easy, quick way to make money. She didn't have time on her side, which was just really sad.
Yeah, no, that is really sad. It's kind of a sad note to end the the interview on, but certainly food for thought. So it just remains for me to thank you so much, Gerri, for your time and for coming on the podcast.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Not a problem. I'll just quickly remind our listeners that they can read more about Mansfield and the Garsington Group, of which Huxley was a part, in your forthcoming book, Katherine Mansfield, A Hidden Life, published through Reaction Books.
It's already published. It was published 2 weeks ago.
Published 2 weeks ago as of recording. Thank you so much.
Thank you.